we'll start with the billion-dollar question, which is, how big is the EdTech market forecasted to be in terms of size, shape, where it's growing? Just tell us about your current perspective on that, Maria.
Yeah. Okay, let me share my screen, because I do have a few slides that help tell that story. Hopefully everyone can see my slides.
Yes, we are.
Right. Okay. All right. So let me just jump straight in there. Firstly, around the education market, because EdTech is part of a subset or a part of the education market, sort of more generally. And sizing the education market, it is $7.3 trillion expected to be. That's the overall education market. That means governments, individuals, parents, companies spending money on education, right from pre-K through to lifelong learning. $7.3 trillion. It's a very, very big market that people don't even think of as a market. The EdTech component, I guess, spend is only 5.5% of that. It's still sort of over $400 billion. It's a big, expected to be by 2025. It's big, but that still only represents just over 5% of total spend in education. So compared with other industries, it's an outlier. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. There's lots of money that is spent on education, and the vast majority of it goes on physical infrastructure and human infrastructure, teachers and so on, of course. And the tech component of that, again, it's only 5%. But what we have been tracking is how that's changing. And so what we're going to be seeing over the next 5 or so years in terms of sort of the initial shock from COVID, and we're expecting to see, and we are already starting to see, a massive digital infrastructure catch up. That's not platforms underneath, but this is learning management systems and even digital content and so on like that. And we're already starting to see that happening. And then, and again, sort of the rise of and the growth of business to consumer models in education, which, have been there, but haven't been sort of huge compared with what they're going to be. And of course, driven by some technology. So really, we're talking about just over $400 billion market for broadly defined EdTech. Just in terms of what that shape looks like, EdTech investment has been just zooming ahead, and look at 2020, it's massive. I think this is going to be the new normal, just given the sort of what's been happening over the last 18 months or so. 2021 is already looking very sort of good for EdTech investment. And this is private money being put into education technology models and all sorts of education technology. And I'll talk about that in a second, but not just learning management systems or those sorts of things, but new ways, like whole new models of delivering learning. And typically that's not in the K-12 space, but certainly post-school, there's a lot of innovation and change happening in that area, as well as all the digital infrastructure catch-up that's needed, because all institutions need to sort of move digitally a bit faster. Just throw any questions at me while I'm going. I've got a few more slides.
No, please. This is lovely on that first. What's the picture? What are the trends, Maria? So I mean, if I just come in there around, I mean, you've sort of indicated there some of the predictions, or not predictions. This is the data, but the trajectories, I suppose, in that post-COVID. Are there any particular types of technologies that seem to be either at the top of the shopping list for the education consumer sector, the schools, the universities, the parents, the teachers, the companies? Are there any that appearing on the scene that are interesting, surprising on either on the purchasing side or on the investment side in terms of what investors are looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Europe, what's interesting is real growth in those direct-to-consumer models, because that's really been relatively nascent in Europe compared with, say, Asia. I've got a slide on that in a minute, but we've seen lots of activity and growth in, online after-school tutoring, or, those sorts of models, or, the sort of homework help. I mean, some, not interested in these models, but, we're talking 40, 50, $60 million investments off the back of massive growth. It's not just investment, it's off the back of growth and demand from the market. And that's that sort of Go Student, Studoco, Brainly, those sorts of models, open classrooms at the post-secondary level, Study Smarter, those sorts of B2C models. Interesting because, as I said, it hasn't been so huge compared with other markets in Europe, but it is really moving in that way. Language learning, of course, and then the infrastructure type models, which are the models that service institutions, teachers, schools, universities, colleges, and so on, learning management systems, digital content. Digital content is really very interesting right now because we're moving from content over the one side and then you have a learning experience over the other. Actually, these two things are together, and technology is now moved enough. It could be sort of immersive or simulated learning. Virtual reality is still, there's definitely lots of activity, but it's not mainstream. But simulated learning, especially in private after post-secondary, workforce upskilling, massive, huge, and getting quite sophisticated. But let me just jump into, I just wanted to zoom out and have a look at North America, Europe, and Asia. And so these are over the last 2 years, this is the fundraising landscape. So this is the number of investment rounds that have gone into EdTech, North America, Europe, and Asia. So you can look at, and the size of the circle is the size of the funding. And so funding isn't everything, of course, but funding means that somebody has convinced an investor to give them money because they are already growing, and that indicates demand, or they are, about to grow, which is the promise, of course. So you can see the size of this. North America, still the number of rounds is huge. It's a very innovative and active ecosystem. And the size of the circles there, they're some good sizes, but there's lots of them. This is the mark of a very active ecosystem. On the right-hand side is Asia generally, and of course dominated by China, just in terms of those very big circles. They're billion-dollar rounds. So less activity, but bigger money. And that says something different about that innovation ecosystem. And then Europe is the sliver there's not a sliver, but in the middle. So less circles, and lots of small ones, but still quite active there. I would say Europe is, given the size of the population and the sort of the education system, it's a little under-indexed on this, although this speaks to context. Context is incredibly important. Europe has a long, long tradition and history of high quality public education. And so that's great, it's amazing. Moving forward, how technology gets integrated into that amazing ecosystem is the thing that's the challenge for Europe, I'd say.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the spending power sits differently, doesn't it, in the public education system than it does in the more established or private education system. So I think one of the biggest challenges as a European is working across and within the languages that we all want to, celebrate and keep, and it's part of our culture. But there's this sort of English always knocking at the front door of many countries, and I think that's a real cultural dilemma for many countries around not letting sort of everything become so anglified, because English is the language of business and the language of finance, and it's a big driver in that respect, isn't it? So very interesting. No, fantastic. So let's hit it. We're in Europe. We've got a lot of European EdTech startups and colleagues from the sector here. What advice do you give to those European companies who are looking to grow, are looking to seek investment, are looking to think about diversifying their products into other markets? What insights can you give us there around how you would advise them to start to look at that?
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting, challenging, but also beneficial, I guess, is Europe is a whole set of different markets. Education is generally very, very context driven. And so what's sort of context in the UK and the context in Italy is probably completely different in terms of education, for example. So it's super hard it's not a European market, it's a lots of different markets. And so one of the things for edtechs, depending on who their customers are, and that's why I mentioned that new direct to consumer model, which is more easily transferable across borders. Because if you're solving a problem, you know, a study problem, I don't know, it could be tutoring, or it could be study notes, or it could be, you know, something like that. It is a bit easier to go directly to the consumer than try to sell through into schools and things like that. So depending on the customer, I would say one of the things if you're an edtech in Europe and you want to expand beyond your geographic boundary, is to understand the context very carefully of the market in which you're just about to enter. And don't make assumptions about that it's going to be similar, because it's definitely not. And so that's one of the things. The other thing that I think is really, really important for not only education, but lots of studies, there's lots and lots of evidence around how ecosystems grow and become strong. And one of those things is lots of interaction and activity between the players, between the actors in a particular ecosystem. And this network that you've got right now is one of those markers. So it's great for a start, but be active inside the ecosystems in which you wish to penetrate. I mean, don't think of it only as I've got this great product and now I'm going to sell it there and there and there and there and there. Become part of that community. Embed yourself into it. Much higher sort of chance of being successful, but also at the same time getting really to know that context. One of the challenges for EdTech and Europe is that there's lots of, in aggregate it's big, but when you cut it down to markets, it's small. And so getting to understand and targeting those very, very closely is one of the things that would be incredibly important.
Thank you for that. And do you know, one of the things I'd like to just drill in a little bit on is, you know, I hear the word context, you know, in almost every conversation around educational technology. And it's one of those words where everybody sort of thinks they all mean the same thing and understand the same thing from it. So from your perspective, Maria, and obviously you've got this background in education, in higher education, what are the sort of contextual factors? What are those sort of important contextual considerations that you're talking about? And then I might bring in a few from the school education sector, but what really matters in terms of context when you're an edtech?
So edtechs generally are trying to make an impact or a difference or solve a problem at a different level. Sometimes they're at the level of the learning. They're right in there and trying to impact learning. At the next level, they're trying to impact something in an organization, or they're trying to change a market. And so obviously there's many more at the middle and lower level in terms of learning and organization than at the, let's make a whole new business model. I mean, that's tough. But so at the level of organization and at the level of learning, the greatest context driver here is if you're selling into, or your whole area is K-12 or even higher ed, but mainly sort of K-12, it's more the curriculum and the way of learning. It's the culture of learning inside the ecosystem in which you're, because when you learn something from a young age, and by the time you're an adult, you've forgotten that really that is one way of doing it. You normalize that, it's invisible now, and then you take those assumptions with you wherever you go. But actually, curriculums are very different. learning sort of habits or learning cultures are very different in each of these geographies. So sort of get to know that if you're operating at the learning level. And that's why we see, for example, lots of solutions that are standard in, well, standard, you know, maths, learning maths, coding, even languages. I mean, that's also context. Everything's got context, but things that can be, you know, that seemingly can be taken across many different contexts like those, and much more difficult in other disciplinary areas, essentially.
No, interesting. I mean, certainly from my perspective, and having supported many EdTechs working in the K-12 school education sector, it's drilling down, as you said, on that understanding of the real context. What do classrooms look like? What do children do in classrooms at different ages? How do teachers behave? You know, it's much more about the culture of the way that you are designing your EdTech for, or you're trying to challenge that in some cases. It's really getting into some of that understanding, which it's very hard to do from afar, you know. So if you're designing for an EdTech in another country, if you've never visited a school or been to talk to teachers and learners, then that's certainly something that should be high on your list. Absolutely. And also it's that staying abreast of the policy changes, the curriculum and assessment, the sorts of risks that, you know, if you've invested a lot to design for a particular country with a particular curriculum setup or assessment setup, and some minister comes in and swipes that away in a decree. You know, I mean, we had a lot of products facing our standard age 16 examinations, revision and whatever, and last year they got wiped out. They had to pivot very quickly because the context changed overnight, and that's one of the sort of risks that we face, isn't it, in the way that education works around the world. It's a hard one. It's very easy to predict, and then it's also not easy to predict. That level of agility, isn't it? No, fascinating. So let's move to focus on particular sectors, and particularly interested in giving your own background and experience in the higher education sector, and obviously quite a number of us partners are based there. It's incredibly challenging for new and emerging EdTech companies to even get to the door of many universities to begin to find the person or the people or the team with which to even initiate a conversation around something that might be innovative in that space. Do you have any good practices or suggestions or guidance for EdTechs who are looking to break into the higher education sector in that way?
Yeah, higher education is a tough one because often decisions, well, there's what happens pre-COVID, and then there's what's happening post-COVID. I mean, so we're sort of, this could change, but very broadly, in higher education, decisions about curriculum and about delivery to a certain extent, and the way things operate are made at the academic level, at the individual academic level, within the constraints or the structure of a program or you know, and so on. And so that is really hard, because who wants to knock on a million academics' doors, you know, and say, hey, do you want to have a look at this? And it depends on the solution that you're bringing. If you're bringing a solution that's going to save a lot of time, it's more like a sort of an efficiency gain, then, you know, you'd be talking to person A. But if you're supporting an academic or have something to do with the learning side of it, then, you know, it's a completely different audience in terms of the sale. And so one of the things that I reflect on, having been on the other side of the fence, is no big organization or network of organizations wants a million point solutions, wants to have a million vendors in their learning life cycle. It's just too hard. It really is. And so they will go for maybe less optimal, maybe with slightly less outcomes, but a simpler way to manage. I think that's a very big sort of lesson for EdTechs. And so to some extent, integrating in, working with, partnering with, if you've got a point solution that is amazing for something to do with assessment, then don't go and knock on a million, you know, doors of universities, but go and talk with learning management systems, go and talk with publishers, go and talk with the people who are in the adjacent areas, because you want to team up with them and become part of their solution, not to sell your company or anything, but to team up. I mean, that's, I think, where actually the future is going to be in terms of EdTech anyway, selling, you know, on the learning stack. I think that's where we're heading. We can see a lot of partnerships occurring. And especially if you've got a very specific point solution, then I would say start thinking about collaboration rather than competition.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And so that pushes me to a follow-on question there, which you might be able to give some insights on, is lots of people talk about the need for interoperability, so that we have these systems that allow particularly learner data, if it's a learning focused solution, to somehow travel between systems, between people, between organizations, you know, with this sort of idea that you might have a cradle to grave education record, in the same way many of us have cradle to grave health records now. Are there any movements in that area? Is that something, is that one to watch if we're again looking ahead, building our little products now, but with big goals and big ambitions? What's going on in the whole area of standardizing, if you like, some of the educational data points that might be sort of necessary in order to be able to get to that point?
I think there's still a long way to go in this area. I mean, you know, the sort of nirvana is some sort of seamless, you know, just, I've never seen it. Look, I think of course there are standards and so on, but and they're emerging, but these things emerge, it's because it's not just at the institution level, it's at the whole sector level, and that is right in the government's purview, and then it becomes, there's issues of policy and so on and so on. And so I think this is quite complex. And then when you try to cross borders, the whole thing, you know, sort of starts again. So I think actually there's a long way to go. I think the world will get there. It's going to take some time, at least in higher education, it's a bit faster than in K-12, just given the age of the population and all that sort of thing, learner information. And it really does depend a lot on the whole approach to of the sort of the culture of education, the government policy, and who's in power, even in governments, that does really rely on a lot of that. So I think actually there's quite a long way to go. Yes.
And do you see any governments that seem to be doing things well? I mean, you know, we often sort of chasing results and things on the PIMS and the TIMS and the PISA tests to try and sort of get this sense of which countries are doing well educationally. From the strategic level, do you see some governments moving in interesting directions in that respect, Maria, or are they all looking to each other for some answers?
Yeah. I think actually, you know, each geography is quite different. You see some countries sort of zooming up these rankings and results and things at very high costs, not money costs, but costs to well-being, costs to student mental health and so on. And now those countries who have been sort of zooming up the charts, so to speak, for many years, are now questioning that singular focus and what the impact of that is. So we see countries like even you know, in China and Korea and those, and Singapore, those sort of countries which are held out as, you know, high quality in terms of those results, starting to completely change their whole exam policies, starting to put rules around student hours of study, policies for student mental health, general education being compulsory, you know, forcing or mandating cultural learning into the curriculum, because it's been pushed out with this singular focus. So it's like they've tipped over some sort of edge And so I think that's a lesson for anyone who's still aspiring like that. I mean, obviously to get the good grades in those things is good, but and pushing everything out for the singular focus to achieve that result has other consequences. And we've seen that in these geographies.
Yeah, no, that's really wise words. And I think, you know, for participants who aren't aware of the work that the OECD is doing in its 2030 vision, really trying to support countries to rethink the breadth and depth and the nature of their school curricula to enable lifelong learners of the type we know we need as the jobs are changing, as the workforce demands and skills are continuing to evolve. And that brings me to the final point before I think we'll open up for some Q&A from the audience. I think we have some questions in there to have a look at. Was this whole huge market of essentially lifelong professional workforce development learning, which is out there, but if you're in the K-12 university world, you can often not be as aware of that as it is. So perhaps, I mean, what you mentioned sort of more of the immersive learning environments, the virtual, not necessarily the virtual augmented reality, but the more sort of simulation type environments. It'd be interesting just to have your thoughts on that before we move to the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just jump through into, this is EdTech funding in Asia across the last 20 years. I mean, K-12 is massive, right? That's the K-12. And this is Europe.
Wow.
It's sort of like flick back. It's actually opposite. And so European EdTech funding, definitely workforce upskilling. And now this is not, think of Asia and their population. It's a young youth population. They need to put a lot of money into K-12. But think of Europe, it's an aging population. And so workforce upskilling and reskilling is very important. So it's very context driven, all these things, of course. But we do see a lot of focus on this, and governments, it's all, you know, sort of the skills agenda of governments. And jobs and skills and reskilling and technology, and it's all wrapped up in those conversations. There's a lot of activity going on there. But when we look at sort of generally Europe, and I know I saw the numbers of who's coming on board on this call, but UK, Spain, Nordics generally, France, of course, Germany, and so on. And I think I've just got one more. So this is around sort of that split. In the workforce space, it's much easier because regulation is nothing like K-12 or higher ed. You can, you know, sort of scale out relatively more easily than in the K-12 or higher education space. And so we're seeing new ways, in particular, the sort of morphing of jobs and skills. So skills and upskilling, and jobs and job finding. So, you know, the HR department and, you know, those sort of people who help you find jobs, and then upskilling, those two models are sort of moving more closely together. And I think that's very interesting. And things like, you know, the Udemy's and open classrooms, those sorts of models are just, we're talking about hundreds of millions of learners upskilling themselves, paying themselves, or their company paying for the upskilling. And so even that, we're seeing a move away from, in terms of volume, away from long form formal education post school through to shorter, more rapid cycle learning. And this is the whole area of micro-credentials and, you know, and the nexus between higher education and workforce. But, you know, I think there's still a long way to go, but the governments around the world are making a big move into building sort of skills wallets. And in the US, the learning and employment record, that's the same sort of thing. There's already one in Canada. There's already one in Singapore. Governments around the world are building this sort of skills wallet to allow you to move from thing to thing. And so once you build that infrastructure and the government starts to incorporate things like micro-credentials into their qualifications framework, which is happening all around the world as well, then you've got a different game in terms of post-school learning. And this definitely is going to impact universities, which have been the only option, really, for a long, long time in terms of learning post-school. So there are now credible alternatives to that. Yes. And the infrastructure for those credible alternatives, i.e. the currency, is being, and the infrastructure for that currency is being built right now. So over the next probably 15 years, we're going to see a very, very big change.
Fantastic. We've got to, I mean, honestly, I could talk all morning, and I know for many of us, there's just so many insights that you're able to surface, I would say, with the data and the very impressive toolkit that you've got sitting, or the engine that you've got there. But I'm just going to finish with one question, which I think is, I mean, it almost sounds trivial, but it isn't. But how do you actually define the EdTech market?
Oh yeah, that's hard. It's that is difficult because, you know, once you start putting things in boxes, you know, and nothing really, to embrace complexity, you need to reject mutual exclusivity. And that's hard to do for humans, because to understand something, we need to put it in a bucket, right? And so EdTech really is broadly defined, any technology that supports learning or the education sector. Now, the tool that we're using right now could be called EdTech. It's right on the edge, but it could be. And so how is that different from how is this tool that we're using now different from those learning management systems that have a synchronous classroom sort of thing? And so that's one component of it. Others define EdTech much less broadly and say, really, unless it's got some impact on learning, then, you know, unless it's designed to impact learning, then it's not really EdTech. I mean, I take a broader definition. And so, you know, at some point in time, will EdTech just be ed? I mean, when does it become so normalized we don't even think about it anymore? That's a tough question.
Well, thank you very much. Honestly, Maria, it's such a great load of insights you've just given us there. Absolutely perfect to open up our final event. So thank you very much on behalf of the network, and I'm sure many of the participants, if they haven't already signed up to your amazing newsletter that comes out, sign up now, because you get this on a weekly basis. So,
thanks, Alison.
Thank you so much. Lovely to talk to you, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and the work that you're doing here in the network, it is truly very important for innovation. It's proven over and over again that these types of networks make a very big impact on moving a sector forward. So congratulations on the work to date.